The night my parents forgot my 19th birthday was the night they unknowingly lost their daughter forever. I didn't realize how true those words would become until 12 years later, when the same people who barely noticed me stood at my front door asking for my help. But that part of the story comes later. Everything began on a warm June evening in our small Ohio hometown, where I still believed birthdays meant something. I spent the entire afternoon decorating the backyard with simple white lights and fresh flowers I had bought using money from my part-time bookstore job. There wasn't anything extravagant about it. I couldn't afford extravagance. I only wanted one evening where my family looked at me instead of my older sister, Olivia. She had always been the center of every celebration, every conversation, every family photograph hanging on our walls. If Olivia won second place, my parents celebrated as though she had conquered the world. If I graduated with honors or earned a scholarship, they would smile politely before asking whether Olivia needed anything. For years, I convinced myself that things would eventually change. 19 felt different. It was my last birthday before transferring to a university several hours away, and my mother had promised, with unusual sincerity, that this celebration would finally be about me. I believed her because daughters are wired to believe their mothers, even after countless disappointments. By 6 o'clock, the backyard looked exactly as I had imagined. The cake sat in the center of the table. Soft music floated through the warm evening air. My father grilled steaks while neighbors slowly arrived carrying small gift bags. I remember feeling nervous instead of excited, as though happiness itself required permission in our family. Then Olivia arrived nearly 40 minutes late, stepping out of a shiny convertible with her new boyfriend beside her. Before I could even say hello, my mother's attention shifted entirely toward her. "Look at you," she exclaimed, rushing across the yard as though a celebrity had appeared. My father abandoned the grill to admire Olivia's expensive jewelry. Guests gathered around her within seconds, asking questions about her new apartment, her latest promotion, and her glamorous weekend trips. I stood beside my own birthday cake, holding a stack of paper plates while conversation drifted further and further away from me. It wasn't unusual, but I kept telling myself they would remember eventually. They had to. It was my birthday. Dinner began without anyone mentioning it. Halfway through the meal, my mother stood and gently tapped her glass with a spoon. My heart actually raced because I assumed she was about to offer a birthday toast. Instead, she smiled proudly at Olivia. "Everyone," she announced, "we have wonderful news. Olivia just accepted an incredible management position in Chicago." The entire backyard erupted into applause. My father disappeared into the house and returned carrying another cake I had never seen before. Across bright gold icing were the words, "Congratulations, Olivia." My birthday cake remained untouched on the side table while everyone surrounded my sister. Someone began singing congratulations. Gifts appeared from the house that had clearly been prepared long before guests arrived. My mother hugged Olivia with tears in her eyes. My father proudly declared that this was the beginning of an exciting new chapter for their favorite daughter. Nobody looked at me. Nobody remembered why everyone had originally gathered. I quietly stepped away from the crowd and stared at the candles still waiting on my untouched birthday cake. 19 tiny flames reflected in the icing, burning for someone no longer visible to her own family. I didn't cry. The strange thing about years of disappointment is that eventually the tears stop arriving. My mother finally noticed me several minutes later. "Emily," she called casually, "could you slice your cake after we're finished celebrating Olivia?" That single sentence settled something permanently inside me. I smiled politely, blew out my own candles without making a wish, carried the untouched cake into the kitchen, picked up my car keys, and walked out the front door without saying goodbye. Not one person followed me. Not one person called my phone that night. By the time they realized I had left, I had already decided that if my family could celebrate life without me, then I would learn how to build one without them. I never told my parents I was leaving. The truth was, they never asked where I was going. For weeks after my 19th birthday, my phone remained painfully quiet. No missed calls. No apologetic messages. No awkward attempts to explain why my celebration had disappeared beneath Olivia's newest achievement. At first, I kept checking my voicemail anyway. Every evening after work at the bookstore, I would unlock my tiny apartment, toss my backpack onto the couch, and glance at my phone before doing anything else. Nothing. It slowly became impossible to tell which hurt more, the birthday itself or realizing they barely noticed I was gone. By August, I packed everything I owned into the back of my 12-year-old Honda Civic and drove 3 hours north to Columbus, where I had accepted a scholarship to finish my architecture degree. The apartment I rented was barely larger than the bedroom I'd grown up in. The kitchen sink leaked whenever it rained. The heating failed twice during my first winter. I worked mornings at a coffee shop, attended classes all afternoon, and spent most nights drawing floor plans until 2 or 3 in the morning. It wasn't glamorous, but every dollar I earned belonged to me, and every accomplishment felt like something no one could take away. There were difficult days, of course. Days when I watched classmates receive care packages from their families while I quietly ate instant noodles between lectures. Days when Father's Day advertisements filled every storefront, reminding me of conversations I no longer expected to have. Every birthday passed almost unnoticed. Sometimes I bought myself a cupcake from the bakery across the street. Sometimes I worked an extra shift instead. It became easier not to expect celebrations. Expectations were dangerous things. They gave disappointment somewhere to live. During my 3rd year, one of my professors stopped beside my drafting table after class. Professor Hayes rarely complimented students, so when he quietly said, "You design buildings that make people feel safe," I carried those words with me for years. He recommended me for an internship at one of the city's fastest-growing architectural firms. I almost declined because I didn't own a professional wardrobe. Instead, I bought one navy blazer from a clearance rack and wore it so often that the sleeves began to fade. Nobody at the firm ever commented on it. They noticed my work instead. For the first time in my life, effort mattered more than comparison. I graduated near the top of my class and accepted a full-time position before commencement. The projects became larger. The responsibilities grew heavier. I specialized in restoring aging historic properties, transforming forgotten places into vibrant spaces where families could create new memories. Ironically, I became skilled at rebuilding things I had never experienced myself. 5 years after graduation, I met Michael Turner during a zoning dispute involving one of my renovation projects. He was the attorney representing our development team. Unlike most lawyers I'd encountered, Michael never tried to dominate a room. He listened carefully before speaking, asked thoughtful questions, and treated everyone, from executives to receptionists, with the same quiet respect. Our first real conversation lasted almost 2 hours inside a nearly empty conference room after everyone else had gone home. We debated architecture, small-town diners, old bookstores, and why people often confused kindness with weakness. Before leaving, he smiled and said, "You always seem prepared for every possible problem." I laughed softly. That's what happens when life teaches you surprises usually aren't good. He didn't ask what I meant. He simply nodded, as though understanding that everyone carried invisible chapters they weren't ready to share. That simple respect made me trust him more than any grand gesture ever could. Over the next several years, our friendship slowly became something steadier. There were no dramatic declarations or whirlwind romance. Just quiet dinners after long workdays, weekend walks through renovated neighborhoods, and countless conversations where silence felt just as comfortable as words. Michael never asked me to forgive my family. He never insisted I reconnect with them. Whenever their names accidentally surfaced, he simply listened. "You don't owe anyone access to your life," he told me once while we watched the sun disappear behind the Columbus skyline. At the time, I believed those words would remain true forever. I had no way of knowing that 12 years after walking away from my parents' backyard, the past was already searching for my new address. The past rarely knocks politely. It waits until you've built a life worth protecting before it comes looking for you again. 12 years had passed since I drove away from my parents' house without looking back. By then, my life no longer resembled the lonely 19-year-old who believed love could be earned by trying harder. Michael and I had recently moved into a restored craftsman home overlooking a quiet park on the edge of Columbus. Every detail inside the house reflected choices we had made together. The walnut dining table we spent months searching for, the shelves overflowing with architecture books and legal journals, the sunroom where I sketched renovation concepts while Michael reviewed contracts. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't flashy. But every brick represented peace, and peace was something I valued more than luxury. That Tuesday morning began like every other. I left for my office before 8, reviewed plans for a historic hotel restoration, attended meetings with contractors, and spent the afternoon solving structural issues that had delayed construction. By 6 o'clock, I was mentally exhausted but satisfied. I had learned long ago that solving complicated problems felt strangely comforting. Buildings followed logic. Families often didn't. When I walked through the front door, the smell of Michael's homemade pasta filled the kitchen. He looked up from the stove with the same calm smile that had greeted me after countless difficult days over the years. "Long meeting?" he asked. "Longer than expected," I answered, slipping off my shoes. "The city wants another environmental review." He chuckled. "Of course they do." We laughed quietly before sitting down for dinner. Halfway through the meal, my cell phone vibrated against the wooden table. Unknown number. I almost ignored it. Years of dealing with contractors meant unfamiliar calls weren't unusual, but something about this one felt different. It rang again almost immediately after stopping. Michael glanced toward the screen. "You expecting someone?" I shook my head and answered anyway. "Hello." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I heard a voice I hadn't listened to in over a decade. Older, slower, almost uncertain. "Emily." My heart recognized my father before my mind accepted it. Richard Carter. I hadn't heard him say my name since I left home. "Yes." My voice surprised even me. It sounded steady, emotionless. "It's Dad." Another silence settled between us. I waited. He cleared his throat. "I know this call is unexpected." I looked across the table at Michael. He quietly stood, collected our empty plates, and disappeared into the kitchen, giving me privacy without saying a word. "What do you need?" I asked. Not "how are you?" Not "why are you calling?" Just the only question that made sense. My father exhaled heavily. "Things haven't gone well." Those 4 words carried 12 years of distance inside them. He explained that the family construction company my grandfather had started was in serious financial trouble. Several large investments had failed. Debt had accumulated. Banks were refusing additional loans. Contracts had been canceled. I listened without interrupting. Eventually, he mentioned Olivia. "She tried to keep everything together," he said. "She did her best." The sentence almost made me smile. Even after all these years, failure still came wrapped in excuses when it belonged to my sister. "And?" I asked quietly. We need someone who understands development. Someone who can negotiate with investors." There it was. The real reason for the call. Not because they missed me. Not because they regretted my 19th birthday. Not because they wanted a daughter back. They needed an architect with a reputation for saving difficult projects. They needed the woman they had spent years pretending didn't matter. "How did you even find me?" I asked. "People know your work now," he admitted. "Your name came up during meetings. Everyone kept saying if anyone could save this company, it would be Emily Carter." Hearing my own father learn about my success from strangers felt strangely fitting. "I see." He hesitated again before saying something I never expected to hear. "Will you come home?" Home. The words sounded foreign. My home was sitting 20 feet away, quietly washing dinner dishes because he understood that some conversations required silence more than advice. The place Richard wanted me to return to wasn't home anymore. It was simply the address where my childhood ended. I looked through the dining room window as evening settled over the neighborhood. For 12 years, I had convinced myself this phone call would never happen. Now that it had, I realized I felt almost nothing at all. "I'll think about it," I said calmly before ending the call. As I placed the phone on the table, Michael returned, studied my face for a moment, and asked only one question. "They're in trouble, aren't they?" I nodded once. Neither of us realized that accepting that single phone call had already pulled us into a story that had never truly ended. Going back didn't feel like returning home. It felt like walking into a building I had designed years ago, only to discover someone else had torn out the foundation. I waited 3 days before calling my father back. Not because I needed time to decide whether to help, but because I needed to understand why I wanted to see them again. Curiosity, I realized, could be more powerful than resentment. Michael never tried to influence my decision. The evening before I left, we sat together on our back porch watching the last light disappear behind the trees. "You already know who you are," he said quietly. "Don't let that house convince you otherwise." I smiled. "I'm not 19 anymore." "I know," he replied. "I'm just reminding you that they might still think you are." The next morning, I drove alone. The familiar highway seemed shorter than I remembered, though every exit stirred memories I thought had faded years ago. The old diner where my father used to promise we'd have breakfast together before canceling because Olivia needed something. The shopping center where my mother insisted we buy Olivia a graduation dress, but told me my old one still looked fine. Memory has a strange way of preserving details you never asked it to keep. By early afternoon, I turned onto the quiet suburban street where I had grown up. The neighborhood looked smaller than it had through the eyes of a teenager. Trees were taller. Sidewalks were cracked. Several houses had fresh paint, but mine looked almost exactly the same. The white shutters needed repairs. The flower beds were overgrown. Even before stepping out of my car, I noticed something else. The driveway, once filled with expensive vehicles Olivia proudly showed off, now held only my father's aging pickup truck. The front door opened before I reached the porch. My mother stood there first. Susan Carter looked older than I remembered. Her carefully styled hair had become mostly gray. The confidence that once filled every movement seemed replaced by nervous hesitation. For a brief moment, she stared at me without speaking. Then she smiled. "Emily," she whispered, as though saying my name after 12 years somehow erased those missing years. She stepped forward as if expecting a hug. I offered a polite smile instead. The awkward pause lasted only seconds, but it said everything neither of us wanted to acknowledge. My father appeared behind her. "It's good to see you." "Hello, Dad." No embrace. No dramatic reunion. Just two strangers connected by history rather than closeness. They led me inside. Almost nothing had changed. The same family photographs still lined the hallway. Most featured Olivia in graduation gowns, beauty pageants, business awards, vacations, birthdays. I appeared in only 2 framed pictures, both taken when I was still a child. Apparently, no one had updated the walls after I left. We sat around the kitchen table where so many uncomfortable dinners had once taken place. My mother poured coffee with slightly trembling hands. "You look wonderful," she said. "You've done so well for yourself." "Thank you. We read articles about your projects," my father added. "The old train station, that waterfront hotel, everyone's talking about your company." I nodded politely. Compliments from strangers felt genuine. Compliments arriving only after success always carried conditions. "So," I finally asked, "tell me what's happening." My father exchanged a quick glance with my mother before answering. Business slowed after the recession. Then a few developments failed. We borrowed more than we should have. Olivia tried expanding into commercial properties. My mother explained quickly. The timing was just unfortunate. Again, they defended her before I had asked a single question. Some habits survived every crisis. "How much debt?" I asked. Silence. My father shifted uncomfortably. "Enough that the bank has given us 90 days. That answer wasn't accidental. People avoid numbers when numbers are dangerous. "I'd like to see the financial statements." My mother blinked. "Already? You asked me to evaluate the situation." "Of course," my father said too quickly. "Tomorrow. Everything is at the office." We talked for another hour, but the conversation never felt like a family reunion. They asked about my career, my home, and eventually Michael. When I mentioned he was an attorney specializing in commercial real estate, another brief glance passed between them. They hadn't invited me because they missed their daughter. They had invited an architect, and unknowingly, a lawyer. As I stood to leave for the hotel I had booked instead of staying in my childhood bedroom, my mother touched my arm. "Emily, we're so glad you came." I looked at her hand before meeting her eyes. "I'm here to understand the situation," I answered gently. "Whether I stay after that depends on what I find." As I walked back to my car, I realized something important. The family I had feared facing for 12 years no longer frightened me. What unsettled me instead was how carefully they were avoiding the truth. Numbers tell the truth long before people are willing to. You simply have to know where to look. The next morning, I arrived at Carter Construction shortly after 8. The office building had once been the pride of our town. I remembered visiting as a little girl, sitting quietly in the reception area while my father proudly introduced Olivia to employees as the future of the company. I was usually handed a coloring book and told not to make too much noise. Walking through the front doors now, I barely recognized the place. Half the reception desks were empty. The walls needed fresh paint. Several lights flickered overhead. Even the atmosphere felt different. Successful businesses have a certain energy. People move with purpose. Conversations sound optimistic. Phones never stop ringing. This office felt quiet in the wrong way. Employees spoke softly. Faces looked tired. The receptionist offered a polite smile that carried more relief than enthusiasm when she recognized me. "Mr. Carter is waiting upstairs." My father greeted me in the conference room with several thick binders already stacked neatly on the table. "Everything you requested is here," he said. "Financial statements, contracts, bank correspondence, current projects." I appreciated the preparation, though I noticed he remained standing instead of sitting beside me, almost as though he already knew what I would find. "I'd like to review these alone," I said. He hesitated. Of course. Once the door closed behind him, silence settled over the room. I opened the first binder and began reading. Income statements, cash flow reports, outstanding loans, vendor obligations. At first glance, everything looked like an ordinary business struggling through difficult economic conditions. But ordinary failures rarely create desperate phone calls after 12 years of silence. By the second binder, patterns began appearing. Several commercial developments had been purchased at prices well above market value. Equipment leases carried unusually high interest rates. Cash reserves had been drained far faster than declining revenue alone could explain. I continued turning pages, making notes as I went. Then I found Olivia's signature. It appeared repeatedly beneath investment approvals totaling millions of dollars. Luxury mixed-use developments, speculative land purchases, high-risk financing agreements. Every project had been approved despite internal reports warning against them. The recommendations from senior managers had been ignored. Olivia had signed anyway. My grandfather built this company by avoiding unnecessary debt. Someone had transformed that philosophy into reckless expansion. Around noon, there was a soft knock at the conference room door. A man in his early 60s stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you might need this." He smiled warmly. "I'm David Foster. I've been the chief financial officer here for almost 25 years. I remembered him immediately. He was one of the few employees who had always treated me kindly when I visited the office as a child. "Thank you." He sat carefully across from me. "I wasn't sure if you'd come back." "Neither was I." He nodded toward the binders. "Then you've probably started seeing what happened." I studied him quietly before asking, "How much of this could have been prevented?" David sighed. "Most of it." That answer surprised me less than it should have. "We warned them," he continued, "again and again. Your parents. Mostly your father." He folded his hands together. "Every major investment carried written risk assessments. The board raised concerns. Department managers raised concerns. Banks raised concerns. But Olivia always had another vision, another presentation, another promise that the next project would solve everything. And my father approved it." David looked down for a moment before answering. "Richard trusted Olivia more than the people who had spent decades building this company." I closed the financial report slowly. It wasn't simply poor judgment. It was the same pattern that had defined our family my entire life. Facts lost to favoritism. Competence ignored in favor of confidence. Reality sacrificed to preserve the illusion that Olivia could never fail. "Does she still work here?" I asked. David gave a tired smile. "She comes in occasionally." That wasn't the answer of an executive running a struggling business. It was the answer of someone describing a visitor. Before leaving, David paused beside the door. "For what it's worth, Emily." He smiled sadly. "A lot of people hoped your grandfather would eventually choose you." I looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "He used to watch you whenever you visited. You asked questions. You listened. You wanted to learn." He hesitated before adding quietly, "He once told me leadership isn't inherited. It's earned." After he left, I remained motionless for several minutes. Nobody had ever told me that conversation had happened. Not my parents. Not my grandfather before he passed away. I returned my attention to the final binder, expecting more evidence of financial mistakes. Instead, tucked between loan agreements and board minutes, I noticed a thin folder labeled simply, "Executive Succession." Something told me the biggest secret inside this company had nothing to do with money. The most dangerous secrets are never locked away. They're filed in ordinary folders because no one expects the right person to open them. I slid the thin succession folder across the conference table and carefully unfolded the first document. It wasn't a will. It wasn't a contract transferring ownership. It was a leadership evaluation commissioned by my grandfather nearly 15 years earlier, only months before his death. Each member of the Carter family had been assessed by an outside consulting firm. Leadership aptitude, financial judgment, risk management, long-term planning, employee trust. Page after page contained objective observations supported by interviews and performance reviews. I wasn't even supposed to know this report existed. My eyes immediately found Olivia's section. Brilliant communicator, highly charismatic, strong confidence. Then came the concerns. Frequently dismisses experienced advisors. Demonstrates elevated risk tolerance. Prioritizes recognition over sustainability. May struggle accepting accountability following unsuccessful outcomes. I slowly turned another page. My own name appeared beneath a photograph I barely remembered having taken. Emily Carter. Demonstrates analytical decision-making. Consistently seeks factual evidence before conclusions. Strong collaborative leadership potential. High employee trust ratings during internship observations. Recommendation: consider Emily Carter as long-term executive successor if she remains interested in the family business. I read the final sentence 3 separate times. Recommendation: consider Emily Carter. My grandfather had seen something in me that my parents had refused to acknowledge. Suddenly David's words made perfect sense. Leadership isn't inherited. It's earned. The office door opened quietly. My father stepped inside carrying fresh coffee. Making progress? He asked with forced optimism. I closed the folder before he could read its contents. I have enough information to begin understanding the financial situation. He smiled with visible relief. Good. I knew you'd figure things out. I have one condition before I continue. His smile faded slightly. What kind of condition? Complete transparency. I met his eyes calmly. Every contract, every loan agreement, every board meeting record, every pending lawsuit. Nothing stays hidden. He nodded almost immediately. Of course. And no one interferes with my review. Agreed. Including Olivia. That answer took longer. She may have opinions. She can have opinions after I finish evaluating the facts. Another pause. Then my father nodded again. All right. I left the office shortly afterward and drove directly back to Columbus. I needed someone who could see the legal risks hidden beneath the financial numbers. Michael opened the front door before I reached for my keys. One look at my face told him everything. It's worse than they admitted. Much worse. We spent the next 4 hours sitting at our dining table while I spread documents across nearly every available surface. Michael reviewed loan agreements while I organized investment records by date. Occasionally, one of us would circle a paragraph before sliding it silently across the table to the other. We had worked together often enough to understand each other's thinking without constant conversation. Finally, Michael leaned back in his chair. Your family doesn't just have financial problems. I know. Some of these agreements expose the company to serious legal liability. Can it be saved? He considered the question carefully. The business can. And my parents? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he closed one of the binders and folded his hands together. That depends on whether they're hiding anything else. The next morning I called my father. I'll help evaluate restructuring options, I said. Relief flooded his voice almost instantly. Emily, thank you. I knew we could count on you. I closed my eyes briefly before responding. Don't misunderstand me. My tone remained calm. I'm not agreeing to rescue anyone. I'm agreeing to examine whether the company itself deserves saving. There was silence. Then he quietly answered, I understand. But I wasn't sure he did. Neither he nor my mother realized that my decision had very little to do with family. The employees deserved honesty. The company my grandfather built deserved one final chance. Whether the Carter family deserved either of those things remained an entirely different question. As I ended the call, another message appeared on my phone from an unfamiliar number. It contained only one sentence. Don't believe everything Dad tells you. We need to talk before you make any decisions. Olivia. I stared at the screen for several long seconds. For the first time since returning, my sister wasn't asking for help. She was asking for a private conversation. And something told me that whatever Olivia wanted to confess would change far more than the company's future. Sometimes the person you've blamed for years isn't calling to defend themselves. They're calling because they've finally run out of lies to hide behind. Olivia suggested we meet at a small coffee shop on the edge of town the following afternoon. It wasn't the kind of place she would have chosen years ago. Back then, she preferred expensive restaurants where everyone could see her walking in. This cafe was quiet, almost hidden between an old bookstore and a florist. When I arrived, she was already sitting by the window. For a moment, I barely recognized her. The perfectly styled hair was gone, replaced by a simple ponytail. Her designer wardrobe had been traded for jeans and a navy sweater. She looked tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. As I approached, she stood awkwardly. "Thanks for coming." I nodded and took the seat across from her. "You said we needed to talk." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, but didn't drink. "Dad told me you're reviewing the company." "Yes." She lowered her eyes. "Then you already know I made some terrible decisions." I waited without speaking. Silence has a way of encouraging honesty more effectively than accusations. After several seconds, she finally looked up. "I wasn't qualified to run the business." The confession landed quietly, almost gently, yet it carried the weight of 12 years. "Then why did you?" I asked. A sad smile crossed her face. "Because nobody ever gave me another choice." I frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" She let out a slow breath. "Do you remember Grandpa asking me to spend weekends at the office after college?" I nodded. Everyone had celebrated it as proof that she was destined to lead Carter Construction. I hated every minute. That surprised me. I wanted to study marketing in Chicago. I wanted to leave this town. She laughed bitterly. "Dad said the company needed me. Mom said Grandpa expected it." Every time I mentioned something different, they reminded me I was the future of the family. I listened carefully. This wasn't an excuse. It sounded more like someone finally admitting they had been trapped inside a role they never wanted. "So why not say no?" She looked at me with tired eyes. "Because saying no wasn't something we were allowed to do in this family." Those words stirred an uncomfortable memory. I was 16 when I received an acceptance letter for a summer architecture program in Boston. It was the first opportunity that truly belonged to me. My parents declined it without asking because Olivia had qualified for a national business competition the same week. They said the family couldn't afford both trips. Months later, they bought Olivia a new SUV to celebrate finishing second. At the time, I thought only I had sacrificed my future for her. Sitting across from Olivia now, I wondered if both of us had simply been assigned different cages. "That still doesn't explain the investments," I said quietly. She nodded. "No, those were my mistakes." Her voice remained steady. "I kept believing one successful project would prove everyone right about me." She reached into her purse and placed a small flash drive on the table. "When the first development failed, Dad refused to tell the board how bad things were." I looked down at the drive. "What's on this?" "Emails, internal reports, bank warnings, every recommendation David and the finance department made." My eyes narrowed. "Why are you giving this to me?" Olivia swallowed hard before answering. "Because Dad destroyed some of the paper copies." I stared at her without speaking. "He said investors would panic if the board saw everything." "Did they?" "Not all of them." She pushed the flash drive closer. "I made terrible business decisions, Emily. I'll accept responsibility for that. But Dad covered them up. Every time another project failed, he borrowed more money instead of admitting the truth." I felt an unexpected heaviness settle in my chest. The financial disaster wasn't simply incompetence. It had become deception. "Why tell me now?" I finally asked. Olivia looked out the window before answering so quietly I almost missed it. "Because for the first time in my life, I don't want you paying for one of my mistakes." We sat in silence until she stood to leave. Before walking away, she stopped beside the table. "Grandpa was right, you know." I looked up. "About what?" She smiled sadly. "He wanted you to lead the company." My breath caught for just a second. Olivia had confirmed what the hidden report only suggested. As she disappeared through the cafe door, I picked up the flash drive, suddenly realizing the financial collapse was no longer the biggest problem. Someone inside my own family had deliberately hidden the truth, and I had just been handed the evidence to prove it. The hardest decision wasn't whether I could save the company. It was deciding whether saving it would also save the people who had broken it. That evening, Michael and I sat together in my office surrounded by binders, printed emails, and the contents of Olivia's flash drive. We worked in silence for nearly 2 hours before either of us spoke. Every document confirmed the same pattern. Financial warnings had been ignored. Independent consultants recommended slowing expansion. Banks advised restructuring after the first major loss. Instead, my father approved larger loans, concealed deteriorating cash flow from portions of the board, and assured everyone the next development would recover previous losses. It never did. Michael removed his reading glasses and looked directly at me. "This stopped being a business mistake years ago." I nodded. "It's a governance failure. And possibly a legal one." Neither of us rushed to conclusions. We had both built careers on evidence rather than emotion. That discipline had protected us more than once. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the framed photograph on the bookshelf behind my desk. It showed Michael and me standing in front of one of my completed restoration projects, smiling without realizing someone had taken the picture. For a moment, I compared that image with the memories of my childhood. I spent years believing my parents had chosen Olivia because she was extraordinary. Now I understood something far sadder. They had chosen the version of the future they wanted to believe in, even after reality repeatedly proved them wrong. What happens if you refuse to get involved? Michael asked. The company probably files for bankruptcy. And hundreds of employees? I sighed. Many lose their jobs. That was the answer that mattered most. Carter Construction had become much larger than my family. Carpenters, engineers, accountants, project managers, receptionists, people who had nothing to do with my parents' decisions would suffer the consequences. The next morning, I requested a meeting with the entire board of directors. My father sounded relieved on the phone. I knew you'd have a recovery plan. I have an assessment, I corrected him calmly. Whether anyone likes it is another matter. The boardroom was nearly full when I arrived. Several directors recognized me from childhood, though many had only heard my name through industry publications over the past decade. David Foster sat quietly near the end of the table. My father occupied the head chair as always. Olivia entered last, avoiding everyone's eyes. Once the meeting began, my father smiled confidently. Emily has completed her review and will explain how we move forward. He sounded almost proud, as though my presence alone guaranteed a solution. I stood, connected my laptop to the projector, and displayed the first slide. Company financial position. The room remained silent as I walked through declining cash reserves, escalating debt, failed developments, and canceled contracts. No one interrupted. Every chart came directly from the company's own records. Then I displayed the next slide. Timeline of executive decisions. Investment approvals. Risk assessments. Internal warnings. Loan extensions. Each date aligned perfectly with supporting documentation. I never raised my voice. I never accused anyone. I simply placed facts in chronological order and allowed them to speak for themselves. My father's confidence slowly disappeared. Finally, I reached my conclusion. Carter Construction can survive. Several directors visibly relaxed. Then I continued. Its current leadership structure cannot. Silence settled over the room. My father blinked. What exactly are you saying? I met his eyes without anger. The company requires immediate independent oversight, complete financial transparency, and new executive management. That's ridiculous, he snapped. We've run this company for decades. You did, I answered calmly. Until evidence shows you stopped managing reality and started managing appearances. Olivia lowered her head without saying a word. She already knew what was coming. I placed a second folder in front of every board member. These are the documents that were never presented during previous financial reviews. My father's face drained of color the moment he recognized the internal emails. He turned sharply toward Olivia. She didn't defend herself. She simply whispered, I couldn't keep hiding it. Around the room, directors began quietly reading the material. No one spoke. The silence was heavier than any argument. As I gathered my notes, I realized something profound. 12 years earlier, my family had erased me from a birthday celebration because they believed I wasn't important. Now the future of everything they had built depended entirely on whether I chose to stay in that room. The board voted before sunset. Not because I asked them to, but because the evidence left them with very little choice. My father resigned as chief executive effective immediately. The board accepted his resignation unanimously. An independent restructuring committee was formed that same afternoon, with David Foster appointed as interim president until a permanent leadership team could be selected. The company's attorneys were instructed to cooperate fully with the financial review, and outside auditors were hired to examine every major transaction from the previous 5 years. No one applauded. There were no dramatic speeches. Businesses rarely end one chapter with fireworks. Most endings arrive in silence, followed by paperwork. My father remained seated long after everyone else had left the boardroom. For the first time in my life, he looked smaller than the chair beneath him. Did you enjoy this? He asked quietly without looking at me. I considered the question carefully before answering. No. He finally raised his eyes. Then why? I gathered my folders before speaking, because someone had to choose the truth over protecting the family name. He gave a tired laugh. I was protecting this family. I shook my head gently. You were protecting an illusion. Those words seemed to reach him more deeply than any accusation could have. I left him sitting alone. Outside the building, several employees waited near the entrance. I recognized carpenters who had worked for my grandfather decades earlier, young engineers just beginning their careers, office staff who had greeted me with kindness even when I was a child nobody noticed. None of them asked for confidential information. One older project manager simply extended his hand. Thank you for giving us a chance. I shook it quietly. The company still has a long road ahead. Maybe, he replied. But at least now we're walking in the right direction. 2 weeks later, the investigation concluded. Most of the financial losses resulted from reckless decisions rather than criminal theft, but regulators imposed substantial penalties for inaccurate financial disclosures made to lenders. My father accepted responsibility and agreed to cooperate fully, avoiding more severe legal consequences. He lost his executive position, much of his personal wealth, and the reputation he had spent 40 years building. Olivia resigned from the company before anyone asked her to. She sent every employee a written apology accepting responsibility for her decisions without blaming anyone else. It was the first time I had ever seen her stop trying to become the person everyone expected her to be. A month later, she accepted a marketing position with a nonprofit organization in another state. During our last conversation before she moved, she smiled more naturally than I could ever remember. I'm finally living a life I actually chose. I believed her. My mother called several times after everything settled. Our conversations remained polite but cautious. One afternoon, she quietly admitted something I never expected to hear. We kept waiting for you to come back and meet us again. I closed my eyes for a moment. I stopped needing your permission a long time ago. She cried softly on the other end of the line. Neither of us tried to erase the past. Some wounds heal without disappearing. David and the board offered me the position of permanent chief executive. I thanked them sincerely before declining. The decision surprised almost everyone except Michael. You built your own life, he reminded me that evening as we walked through one of my newest restoration projects. You don't have to inherit someone else's. He was right. I agreed to remain an outside strategic advisor during the restructuring, helping preserve the company my grandfather loved while continuing the architectural career I had built with my own hands. It was enough. On my 31st birthday, Michael organized a quiet dinner at our home. Just the two of us. No speeches, no obligations, no forgotten promises. After dessert, he placed a small wrapped box in front of me. Inside was the old silver compass my grandfather had once carried to construction sites, carefully restored after David discovered it among company archives. Attached was a handwritten note in David's familiar handwriting. He always believed you knew how to find your own direction. I held the compass in my palm for a long time without speaking. 12 years earlier, my family had erased my 19th birthday as though it had never mattered. They thought being overlooked would define the rest of my life. Instead, losing their approval became the moment I found myself. And in the end, the greatest victory was never saving the company they almost destroyed. It was building a life so complete that I no longer needed the family who once believed I would never succeed without them. People often ask when forgiveness begins. They imagine a single conversation, a heartfelt apology, or one extraordinary moment that erases years of disappointment. My experience was different. Forgiveness, if it came at all, arrived quietly through distance, boundaries, and the simple realization that I no longer needed the past to change before I could move forward. Nearly a year passed after the restructuring began. Carter Construction survived. The recovery was slower than anyone hoped, but it was honest. Projects were completed on schedule again. Vendors returned. Employees who had feared losing everything gradually regained confidence. David called me every few weeks to discuss strategy, and I continued serving as an outside advisor, reviewing major expansion plans without ever stepping into an executive office. It was exactly the balance I wanted. I could help protect my grandfather's legacy without sacrificing the life I had built for myself. One crisp autumn afternoon, Michael and I drove through my hometown on our way to inspect a historic restoration project nearby. We had no intention of stopping at my parents' house. Yet as we passed the familiar street, I noticed my father working alone in the front yard. He looked older than I remembered only a few months earlier. Retirement had arrived without celebration, leaving behind long afternoons and too much time to think. He noticed our car and slowly raised a hand. Michael glanced at me but said nothing. The decision was mine. I asked him to pull over. My father walked toward us with the cautious expression of someone unsure whether he still deserved a conversation. "Hello, Emily." "Hello, Dad." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, "The roses finally came back." I looked toward the garden. My grandmother had planted those rose bushes decades before. As children, Olivia and I used to race between them while our grandfather pretended not to notice. "She always said they needed patience," I replied. He nodded slowly. She was right about a lot of things. The silence that followed felt different from the silence we had shared in the boardroom. It wasn't heavy with anger anymore. It was simply honest. "I've been thinking about your 19th birthday," he said at last. "More than I should have." I waited. "I can't change what we did." "No," I answered softly. "You can't." He looked down at his hands. "I kept telling myself there would always be another birthday." His voice cracked slightly. "I never understood that sometimes one day changes everything." I felt no satisfaction hearing those words. Only sadness for the years none of us could recover. "I built a good life, Dad," I said. "Not because of what happened that day, but because I finally stopped waiting for this family to become something it wasn't." He nodded, tears filling his eyes without falling. "I'm proud of you." 12 years earlier, those words would have meant everything to me. Now they were simply kind words from an aging father trying to make peace with his own regrets. "Thank you," I replied. And for the first time, I realized I believed he meant them. Before leaving, he reached into his pocket and handed me a small brass key. "Your grandfather's workshop," he explained. "It belongs to you now." Weeks later, Michael and I unlocked the old building together. Dust covered nearly every surface, but the workbench remained exactly as I remembered. Hanging above it was a faded wooden sign my grandfather had carved by hand. "Measure twice. Build once." Character works the same way. I stood there smiling through quiet tears. My grandfather had never left me wealth beyond imagination. He left me something far more valuable: the belief that careful work, integrity, and patience would always outlast pride. As Michael slipped his hand into mine, I understood the story had never truly been about revenge. It wasn't about proving my parents wrong or watching my sister fail. It was about refusing to let someone else's choices determine the rest of my life. They chose Olivia over my 19th birthday. Years later, when they needed me most, I chose something they had never taught me. I chose truth over approval, peace over resentment, and a future built not on being accepted by my family, but on finally accepting myself. Life has a quiet way of testing whether you've truly changed. Not with dramatic confrontations or impossible choices, but with ordinary moments that would have broken the person you used to be. Nearly 3 years passed before I realized how rarely I thought about my 19th birthday anymore. The memory hadn't disappeared. It had simply become one chapter in a much larger story instead of the title of my life. My architecture firm continued to grow, taking on restoration projects across several states. Michael's practice expanded as well, though he still insisted on leaving the office early whenever we had dinner plans. Success no longer felt like something I needed to prove. It simply became the natural result of years spent doing meaningful work with people I trusted. One Friday afternoon, David called with news I hadn't expected. "We finalized everything today," he said. "Carter Construction has officially completed its restructuring." I smiled. "Congratulations." "There's something else." He paused for a moment. "The board voted to rename the annual Leadership Scholarship." "Oh, it's now called the William Carter Integrity Scholarship." "My grandfather's name." "It will fund engineering and architecture students who demonstrate leadership through service rather than grades alone." I remained silent for several seconds. He would have loved that. "There's one more detail," David added. "The selection committee asked if you'd agree to mentor the recipients each year." I looked through the window of my office at a group of young interns walking across the construction site outside. I remembered being 19, believing one forgotten birthday had determined my worth forever. "I'd be honored," I answered. A month later, I attended the first scholarship ceremony. The event was held inside the newly renovated headquarters of Carter Construction. The building looked familiar, but the atmosphere felt completely different. Transparency reports were displayed openly. Employees spoke comfortably with management. Young professionals presented ideas without fear of being ignored because of their last name. The company my grandfather imagined had finally become real, though it had taken painful lessons to get there. As the ceremony ended, I noticed my parents sitting quietly near the back of the room. They hadn't been invited onto the stage. They weren't introduced as honored guests. They had simply come to watch. After everyone began leaving, my mother approached me first. "You looked happy up there," she said softly. "I was." She nodded with a small smile. "I used to think happiness came from having the perfect family." I waited. "Now I think it comes from becoming the person you were meant to be, even if your family gets in the way." Those words surprised me more than any apology ever had. Growth sometimes arrives later than we expect. My father joined us a few moments later carrying a small envelope. "This belonged to your grandfather," he said. Inside was an old black and white photograph of Grandpa standing beside the very first truck Carter Construction ever owned. Written across the back, in his familiar handwriting, were the words, "Build things that outlive your pride." I carefully slipped the photograph back into its envelope. "Thank you." He smiled gently. I finally understand what he meant. As Michael and I walked toward our car that evening, he reached for my hand. "You know," he said, "if someone only met you today, they'd never guess how your story started." I laughed quietly. "That's because it didn't really start with my family." He looked at me curiously. "No." I shook my head. "It started the day I decided someone else's opinion would never again become the measure of my future." We drove home beneath a sky painted with the colors of early autumn. For the first time in many years, my hometown no longer felt like the place where I had been forgotten. It had become simply another place on the map, one that held both painful memories and unexpected healing. My parents had chosen my sister over my 19th birthday. They lost years they could never recover because of that decision. But I discovered something they never understood while I was growing up. The greatest inheritance a person can receive is not a company, a house, or a family name. It is the courage to walk away from who others expect you to be and quietly build the life you know you deserve. In the end, that was the only birthday gift that truly lasted forever. People sometimes believe the ending of a family story is the day everyone finally agrees. Mine ended the day I accepted that agreement was never the goal. Peace was. 5 years after the boardroom meeting that changed everything, my life looked nothing like the future I had imagined as a frightened 19-year-old walking away from my parents' house with a single suitcase. My architecture firm had expanded into 3 offices, each dedicated to restoring historic buildings that other companies considered too complicated or too expensive to save. There was something deeply satisfying about bringing forgotten places back to life. Perhaps that was why I loved the work so much. I understood what it meant to see value where others only saw failure. Michael often joked that I collected abandoned buildings the way some people collected antiques. He wasn't entirely wrong. Every project reminded me that broken things didn't always need replacing. Sometimes they simply needed someone patient enough to understand them. One spring morning, I stood before a group of university students who had received the William Carter Integrity Scholarship. They were nervous, ambitious, and eager to prove themselves. Looking at them felt strangely familiar. I saw pieces of my younger self in each face. One student raised her hand during the question and answer session. "What was the biggest turning point in your career?" she asked. The audience expected a story about architecture or business strategy. Instead, I smiled. "The biggest turning point wasn't professional," I said. "It was personal." The room became quiet. I stopped trying to earn love from people who had already decided not to give it freely. Several students exchanged thoughtful glances. When you spend your energy chasing someone else's approval, you have very little left to build your own future. The day I redirected that energy toward my own goals, everything changed. After the presentation ended, the young woman approached me privately. "I think I needed to hear that," she admitted. "Then it was worth saying," I replied. That evening, Michael and I returned home to find a handwritten letter waiting in our mailbox. The envelope carried my mother's familiar handwriting. She rarely wrote letters anymore. Inside was a simple note. "Your father passed away peacefully this morning. Before the end, he asked me to tell you that he hoped you never doubted how proud he became of you. He knew he learned that lesson far too late." I read the letter twice before folding it carefully. There were no tears at first, only a long silence. Michael wrapped an arm around my shoulders without saying a word. Sometimes love understands that silence is more comforting than advice. We attended the funeral a few days later. It was modest, exactly as my father had requested. Former employees, neighbors, old friends, and business partners filled the small church. Many spoke about his generosity, his work ethic, and the years he spent helping young contractors begin their careers. Listening to their memories reminded me that people are rarely defined by only their best decisions or their worst ones. We leave behind a mixture of both. After the service, Olivia stood beside me beneath the shade of an old oak tree. "Do you think he found peace?" she asked quietly. I looked toward the church where the last guests were beginning to leave. "I think he spent his final years trying to become a better man than the one we grew up with." She nodded slowly. "Maybe that's enough." "Sometimes," I answered. "It's the most any of us can do." Before we left the cemetery, I placed my hand gently against my grandfather's headstone, standing beside my father's newly marked grave. 2 generations. 2 very different men. One taught me how to build. The other taught me why character mattered more than success. As Michael and I drove home, I realized I no longer carried the weight of proving anyone wrong. That burden had quietly disappeared years earlier. What remained was gratitude for the life I had created, for the people who chose me without conditions, and for the strength that had grown from wounds I once believed would never heal. My parents chose my sister over my 19th birthday. That decision changed the course of my life forever. But not in the way they expected. They thought rejection would make me smaller. Instead, it forced me to discover that my worth had never belonged in their hands at all. And once I understood that truth, no one could ever take it away again. If there is one lesson my life has taught me, it is this. The family you are born into may shape your beginning, but it never has the authority to decide your ending. Every year on my birthday, Michael asks me the same question before breakfast. "What do you want to do today?" It sounds simple, but he knows why it matters. For most of my childhood, birthdays belonged to everyone except me. There was always another celebration that mattered more, another sacrifice I was expected to make, another reason my happiness could wait. Now, the choice is always mine. On my 40th birthday, we drove to the lake where my grandfather had once taken Olivia and me fishing during the few summers when work allowed him a free afternoon. The old wooden dock had been rebuilt, but the water looked exactly the same. Calm, patient, unhurried. Michael unpacked a picnic while I stood at the edge of the lake, watching small circles spread across the surface where fish occasionally broke through. Time has a remarkable way of softening memories without erasing them. I could still remember standing alone outside my parents' house at 19, carrying a suitcase with trembling hands after everyone forgot my birthday. I could still hear the laughter drifting through the windows as Olivia celebrated her engagement inside. For years, I believed that moment had been the worst day of my life. Looking back now, I understood it differently. It wasn't the day my family abandoned me. It was the day my real life quietly began. Later that afternoon, my phone vibrated with a message from Olivia. We spoke occasionally now, never pretending we could recover the childhood we had lost, but learning to build something more honest between us. She had married a kind man, started a family of her own, and built a successful career in nonprofit marketing. Her message contained only a photograph. My niece stood in front of a birthday cake, wearing a paper crown and smiling from ear to ear. Underneath the picture Olivia had written, she insisted everyone sings to every child first before anyone cuts the cake. She says birthdays should never belong to somebody else. I smiled longer than I expected. Sometimes healing doesn't arrive through grand gestures. Sometimes it quietly appears in the next generation choosing to do better. That evening, as the sun disappeared behind the trees, Michael handed me one final birthday gift. It wasn't wrapped. It was a leather-bound journal with my initials pressed into the cover. "Open the first page," he said. Inside, he had written only one sentence. "Your story deserves to be remembered by people who need hope more than revenge." I traced the words with my fingertips. For years, I thought the purpose of telling my story would be to expose the people who hurt me. Eventually, I realized something far more important. Stories like mine are not about proving that cruel families exist. Most people already know they do. They are about reminding the quiet person sitting alone somewhere that another ending is possible. You can leave. You can rebuild. You can create a life so full that yesterday's rejection becomes only a distant chapter instead of your identity. Before we packed everything into the car, I walked to the end of the dock one last time. The restored silver compass my grandfather once carried rested comfortably in my pocket. I opened it, watching the needle settle steadily toward north. When I was younger, I thought finding direction meant discovering where I belonged. Now I understood the truth. Direction has never been about where you start. It is about choosing, day after day, who you become despite where you started. My parents chose my sister over my 19th birthday. They believed one forgotten celebration would define my place in the family forever. They were wrong. They lost a daughter they never truly tried to know. I gained a husband who never forgot a single birthday, friends who became family by choice, a career built with integrity, and a life filled with peace instead of permission. If my grandfather were standing beside me that evening, I think he would smile the way he always did after finishing a difficult project, not because every mistake had been avoided, but because something lasting had finally been built. And as I closed the compass and slipped it back into my pocket, I realized that was the true ending of my story. I was never the forgotten daughter. I was simply the one who found the courage to walk away, build something better, and never look back.